Arratsaldeon, buenas tardes y bienvenidos. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos esta tarde aquí en el auditorio y también gracias.
Thank you very much for coming here this afternoon and for following this presentation.
Desde el canal de YouTube del museo y la están siguiendo online. Es un placer contar con ustedes, con vosotros.
It's wonderful to be here with you tonight, and we have with us Dr. David Eagleman, who forms part of the public program of the exhibition, the Roaring Twenties. This exhibition has been sponsored by the BBK, and this is a stimulating review of the 20s of the previous century through representative objects showing different disciplines like drawings, photography, paintings, architecture, fashion, or furniture even. And as you know, this was a decade, I'm talking about the roaring 1920s. It was a time of progress, and also when there was a reaction to the traumatic experiences that had just occurred at the end of World War I, as well as the sequelae that had to do with the pandemic of the so-called Spanish flu, not because it was Spanish, but rather because it was Spain that was disclosing what was going on at that time. And these events, these tragic events, were what brought about a very strong desire to live, to enjoy, and to create that can be seen in the exhibition that's on the second floor of the museum. The exhibition is focused on change and progress, and it addresses movements like Bauhaus, Dadaism, new objectivity, and the focus is placed on the origin or on the change or the transformation and the desire to live. And many of the elements that can be seen in the show were still present, although in some cases they were invisible, but they were present in our lives. And I would like to encourage you to visit this show. It's going to be here for the entire summer, and even more so now that you can get to know how neurosciences were developed between the two world wars, and also discover the mechanisms that have been used that became manifest at that particular point in time regarding the brain, the human brain, and which makes sense in the current context that we are experiencing. But to talk about these issues, we have with us tonight, we have Professor David Eagleman, who's a very well-known neuroscientist. He works at the University of Stanford, and he's a specialist in brain plasticity, in the perception of time and the substitution of the senses and synesthesia. He has more than 120 publications, academic papers too, apart from books like Incognito or The Secret Lives of the Brain or Live Wired. And Dr. Eagleman here is to share his discoveries, and he wants to open up this field to the general public, and he's written and directed many documentaries for the BBC on Netflix, for instance. And he also forms part of this research work in the context of our exhibition, the Roaring Twenties, and this is what he's going to be discussing with us here tonight. Oh, it's this morning for him because he's connecting from California in the States. So once again, many thanks for coming here tonight. I hope that you will enjoy the lecture, because first we're going to have a presentation by Dr. Eagleman, and then we're going to have some room for questions, a conversation with Professor Eagleman. I hope that you would enjoy this, and I hope that you will not only enjoy the lecture, but also the exhibition and the museum. Right, good afternoon, or good morning, David.
Having me here.
It's a real pleasure to have you with us. So the floor is yours.
Great.
And we will keep conversation in a few minutes. Thank you.
Okay.
Gracias a todos.
Terrific. Okay, well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So I thought what I'd start with is some interesting data that just came out from the Center for Disease Control here in America. And the question is, what happened to the rate of suicides in 2020? So think about, what your answer is. Do you think suicides went up or went down, especially after March of 2020? Well, here's the interesting thing about what happened. Since the year 2000, 21 years ago, the suicide rate has been going up by about 25%. And then 2020 came, and the suicide rate dropped by about 5.6 nationally. Now, how do we understand that? Because this has been a year of great struggle. It's been full of stress and anxiety. And in March of last year, the calls to mental health crisis lines went up by almost 900%. So everybody predicted that suicides would skyrocket in 2020, but they didn't. And the question is why? Well, there's all kinds of new data, and we'll be studying this for a while, but this is a very good entry point, I think, into figuring out where we are and what our emergence is going to look like. So this has been a really awful time for so many people in so many ways, but instead of all that, lousy news that we've been living with, this is a perfect time to take the spirit of this current exhibit at Guggenheim on the Roaring 1920s and to understand what the silver linings are about where we are right now and whether we're heading for a second coming of the Roaring 1920s. So the first silver lining starts here, which is that we've all complained mercilessly about Zoom and Zoom fatigue. But here's the thing. Can you imagine if this pandemic had hit us 30 years ago in the 1990s, when we had the same amount of travel to spread the virus, but we were home alone and didn't have the internet? Really picture what this pandemic would have been like without the internet. Everything would have been so much worse in terms of keeping businesses alive and supply chains running, but also in terms of the ability to stay connected to friends and family at a distance. So just as one example, my father died in August, and we had so many relatives come on Zoom for the services. It was a bigger funeral than it would have ever been normally, because people didn't have to fly in. It was just an hour or so that they were on the Zoom, and then they were back to their lives. So it was easy to be there. And I wish I were in Bilbao in person. I've been there before and I loved it. But the truth is, it's very easy for me to come visit you today in between my other meetings, because, it was exactly as easy to accept this kind invitation as it was to accept a meeting down the street. And so thank goodness we have the internet right now during this pandemic. And on a population level, there's the issue of mental health. So telehealth psychology visits shot up this past year. And researchers suspect the increased access to mental health care via Zoom had a very protective effect. So having a blanket of connectivity around the world is the kind of technology that is so miraculous that it's totally invisible to us and we don't even appreciate it. But in the context of what this last year has been for us, it's worth understanding how positive that has been. And I'll just mention also some researchers have been studying the way that the shelter in place and remote work has changed things for many people. So it's left many of us with less alone time. And even though that's generally driven us all crazy, it's had some positive benefits in terms of reducing feelings of helplessness and isolation by constantly being embedded in a network of other people. And, none of this diminishes how hard this past year has been for everyone. But for many people, they found an unusual forced opportunity to rethink everything and to be forced into a different lifestyle that they would have never chosen. So for myself and probably for everybody here, a number of people here, it was part of my daily life to travel all the time. I was living on airplanes and in hotels, And if you're like me, you've been complaining for 14 months about not traveling. But now the idea of living on airplanes again is a little harder to jump onto, because we've been exposed to a different world that we never would have chosen. But there are many things we're going to miss about this slower pace that we've been exposed to and we didn't expect. So I feel differently about travel now than I used to, and I suspect that's true for many people. And the related issue is that a lot of people have had some self-insight during this time, and they realized that they are introverts. So I'm not. I'm an extrovert, but so many introverts are telling their bosses, "Hey, I've just discovered something about myself. I'm not going back to work. I'm not interested in going back to an office." And so it's just been a real time of getting to explore things where people have figured things out. And, one of the questions, I live in Silicon Valley, and one of the questions for all of us who are running companies is what this translates to for our teams in the months ahead. The data, at least here in Silicon Valley, is that a lot of people are less interested than expected in going back to work full time. People are having all kinds of conversations about part-time or full-time remote. And I run a startup company on the side, and about a third of my employees have left the expensive Silicon Valley and moved to nicer small towns in America. They just moved to nicer places to live. And they still want to be part of the company, but many are pretty certain that they want a new lifestyle, and they're not sure that they're ever going to come back in person. So, as long as this stays true, this is going to really alter so many things, including, by the way, the commercial real estate landscape. So here where I live, there are huge campuses, Google and Facebook and Apple, they've got these huge campuses. And my suspicion is that at least for a while, these really large companies are not going to get everybody back. And I think they're going to have to start a bunch of small satellite offices, because people just aren't interested in making huge commutes and driving every day, but they're interested in smaller commutes. So to be in the best position to understand what's happening with all this and what's going to happen, the important vantage point to understand is what has happened to our brains and our psychology during this past year. And so for that, I'm going to turn to a single fundamental concept about how brains work, and that is the internal model. And the key is that your brain is locked in silence and darkness, and this is all it ever sees, and its job is to build an internal model of the outside world so that it can understand what's happening out there. So let me give you an example of this. I'd like everyone to try this. So imagine that you're driving 30 miles per hour down the road. So I want you to hold your steering wheel, and I want you to lane change from the center lane into the right lane. So go ahead and make your lane change from the center lane to the right lane. Okay, so I'm unable to see the audience, but what I'm guessing you probably did, because this is what everyone does, is they turn like this and then back to center. Okay, that's what you did. That turns your car this way, and you go over the sidewalk and you crash into a building. So the way that you actually make a lane change is you turn to the right, back to center, just as far to the left, and back to center again. That's what a lane change looks like, and you do it all the time, but you don't know how you do it. And this is because your brain has a model of physics and cars and steering wheels, and you don't even know it has this. Your brain does so many things unconsciously, and you don't even know how you're doing it. And this is the case with all of our internal model, all the actions in your life. And your entire life up until March of 2020, all the things that you did, how to go to work, how to run a meeting, who to expect to be there when you get home, where your bed is, how to wash dishes, all this stuff was just totally natural to you. It felt natural because it was part of your model of the world. And as a result, you pay very little attention in environments like this because you have a good model of it. And if you have a good model, you don't need to pay any attention. But when you're in a new environment, you pay lots of attention. So if you're traveling around a new city, trying to find directions to the museum, you're forced to look around at everything, the street signs and the names of the stores and the building numbers, because you don't already have a good model of what to expect. So you need to pay attention to what's going on out there. And this is what has happened during the pandemic, is we're paying attention to everything because our internal model is disrupted. I'll come back to this in a second. What I want to say is that, why do we have an internal model at all? It's because fundamentally your brain is a prediction machine. And that's the driving engine behind all of the learning and changing that it does. You're trying to have a model of the world so that you can guess ahead into the future. So by modeling the way the world works, the brain reshapes itself to jump off the diving board into the future, to have good predictions of what comes next. So we try to understand the present so that we can leap into the future. And we're a species that is always trying to predict what happens next, and the best way to do so is to have a good understanding of the present. So that's the foundation that I want to tell you to understand everything else that I'm about to tell you, which is what happens when a pandemic hits that suddenly locks us into our homes, our families, our workforces, everything's locked in our home. The thing is that all of our predictions stop running correctly. So suddenly all of our model of the world and what happens next, none of that's happening anymore correctly. And as a result, we're forced to examine, probably for the very first time, all the pieces, parts that make up our lives. So, normally you update your model all the time, your internal model of the world. You update it in 100 small ways. You say, what was that person's name again? Or, I didn't know my coffee machine had this button on it. Or, that's how to get to that new restaurant. But what happened 14 months ago is that this turned into a massive storm of updating our model. And, our internal model of the world became totally insufficient. And it required massive revision. And this sort of failure or unraveling of our internal model is very challenging. And it's no surprise that anxiety went really high, because our routines and our habits, those all became shredded. And suddenly we found ourselves in a situation where we were required to think about the complex relationship between things. And for those people in business, you're thinking about the relationship between stores and supply chains. And for those of us who are just trying to eat, figure out what to do, we're thinking about restaurants and gig workers and hospital healthcare workers and Uber drivers, janitors and dentists and police officers. And we were thinking about how everything was connected so that you would know if the coffee shop down the street was going to be open or not open, or whether you'd be able to get toilet paper or not, or whether you'd be able to get food in your refrigerator or not. And so, depending on exactly where you lived, you might have to think through several steps to make a good guess about that. But the point is that we had never really thought about many of these things before. This was all new to be forced to think about that. Because it used to be that you just say, okay, I'm going to go down to the store, and I know that toilet paper is on aisle 8 and the food is over on aisle 3, and you just go and you get your stuff taken care of. But suddenly we had to think about things in a new way. And so, one of the things that's been interesting to me is that in a time of uncertainty like this, the brain wants very badly to grab onto ideas that can frame the future, that can provide scaffolding for it, that can restore parts of the foundation that are suddenly gone. And so, but the problem is the whole system of infection and travel and government restrictions and vaccines and all that, it's too big and nonlinear. And so this whole time, no one has had a crystal ball to understand exactly what's going to happen next. And so we all had this experience of reading something online and saying, oh yeah, that's clear. I'm convinced that, this is all over in 2 weeks. And then you read something else online and you say, oh yeah, millions are going to die. And, you can read totally contradictory things during this past 14 months, and it all sounds convincing. We internalize this and we parrot it later because we just wanted certainty. And by the way, that's why it was hard to miss that conspiracy theories have thrived during this past year and a half. Why? It's because the normal load of evidence is not required. Instead, all that your brain wants is something that's short and clear and explains something, and you're on board because your brain has been, desperate for foundation. And not surprisingly, when our model gets worse, we're not so good at thinking into the future. And so that's essentially what this past year was for us. And just one thing I want to mention, which is so interesting, is what happened to time during this past year in the retrospective direction. And one of the things that I know everybody faced is this issue of, how much time passed in lockdown? Because during lockdown, hours bleed into days and days bleed into weeks. It's just hard to keep track of things. Sometimes it felt like, okay, that's been a month. Sometimes it felt like, was that 3 months ago? Sometimes it feels shorter, longer. We can't even remember a lot of things. It's been very difficult to keep track of the passage of time. Here's a one of 100 memes that I found online. The days of the week are now called this day, that day, other day, someday, yesterday, today, next day. So from a neuroscience point of view, this is no surprise that this happened, because we all know that, clocks run regularly, but our memories don't. And so it turns out that the brain estimates how much time has passed by referencing how much memory it has, how much memory it can draw on. So here's what I mean. Some events seem to have lasted a long time, like, the great trip that you took a couple of years ago, or, the first time that you faced a great new challenge, or the first time that you drove to your new place of work. But other events seem to be shorter than their clock time. Like, the 3 months you spent at work doing the exact same routine, or your drive to work now that you're used to it. So, because the reason this happens is because when I ask you, how long did that thing last, your brain searches for events and landmarks that have happened. And the more it finds, the more time it assumes has passed. So, for example, you have more memories there and you have fewer memories there. And so when your brain has to scramble to find any memories, it assumes little time has passed. But when there's lots of footage, when there's lots of film for it to draw on, then it says, oh, must have taken a very long time. So the point is that this lockdown has been the work routine. It hasn't been the foreign adventure, because despite facing new challenges, you've been inside the same four walls, mostly thinking the same challenges over and over. And so little of this time has been clearly distinguishable. So when we look back on these months of lockdown, there aren't many new landmarks on the map that we can use to orient ourselves. And that makes the duration very difficult for your brain to pin down. So as the world struggles towards recovery, one of the advantages will be getting our internal models back, which means we'll get our time perception back. And we'll be able to tell again how much time has passed. Now, here's the main silver lining that I wanted to concentrate on, though, is that has to do with what's called brain plasticity, which is the ability of the brain to change itself. Okay, so you have 86 billion brain cells called neurons, and these are constantly changing, and they're plugging in, and they're changing the strength, and they're unplugging, and they're seeking and replugging, and the whole forest of your enormous 86 billion brain cells is constantly changing and moving and evolving. So here's the thing. Normally, if 2020 had been a normal year, we're deeply embedded in our routines. And as a result, especially, in a normal adult brain, less and less changes. Okay, so when you get to be an adult, you're just not changing that much in your brain. But as we get better at modeling the world, as we get better at modeling the world, our system settles into place. It doesn't change much. This is if things are going normal, you're a normal adult, things kind of get locked into place. But the good news is that lots of studies demonstrate that when we take up a new skill, like learning how to juggle or learning a new musical instrument, there are visible changes in the structure of the brain. So I can look at your brain in neuroimaging. I can look at a brain scan of your brain, and after you learn something new, like juggling or violin, I can see physical changes in the structure of your brain. The changes are so big, that's what you can see. And so, this is what brain plasticity is about, is giving ourselves new challenges, novel things. And in fact, the best medicine that we know to prevent dementia is seeking new novelty and new challenges. That's how you shake up the circuits. It's that these things actually cause changes in our brain and give protection. So in other words, if you just live life, normally in a routine, your brain will settle into place and nothing much will happen. But if you constantly seek new challenges, if you constantly put yourself in the zone between frustrating and achievable, then your brain changes. Things are actually moving around. And actually, I'll mention something, which is there has been a very long-term study of nuns, Catholic nuns, who donated their brain when they died. And so what the researchers discovered is that some fraction of these nuns had Alzheimer's disease, but nobody knew it when they were alive. Nobody knew it because they lived in the convent until the day they died. And in the convent, they had all kinds of challenges all the time. They were doing chores, and they were dealing with other people, and they were playing games, and they had responsibilities, and so they were constantly doing stuff with their brains. And as a result, even though their brain was physically degenerating with Alzheimer's disease, they were constantly building new roadways between, A and B and C and D. They were building new roadways, and so even though they had Alzheimer's disease, they didn't have the cognitive symptoms that usually go along with it. So finding ways to challenge your brain actually gives protection. So the good news is that the epidemic has brought to our lives a neural shakeup. So all the things that I mentioned before about the downside of losing your internal model, not performing well enough, this has an upside too, which is that we've been able to rethink everything about our lives. And I'll bet that everyone here has rethought issues about how you spend your time and what kind of career you want to pursue and who you care about spending time with, and all kinds of questions that you might not have had the time or the motivation to really rethink if life had just continued on its standard rails. So everybody is wondering, everybody's asking about whether we will return to normal or whether it's going to be a new normal. And, until a few months ago, I think, especially in November and December, it was pretty easy to think, wow, this can never go back to normal. But my prediction is that things will continue to get, much better. I mean, we're already seeing things really improving, but we can't ever go back to the old normal. We can never return to where we were because we've seen too much. We've learned too much about ourselves. We've shaken up our circuits too much, and we have a new view on things. We have a view that we would not have had if 2020 had been a normal year. And this is not just speculation. From the very beginning of this pandemic, I started really studying what had happened in the 1918 influenza epidemic, which is the theme of the epidemic, the theme of the exhibit at the Guggenheim right now. And first of all, this was far worse than it is now. I mean, this epidemic was devastating compared to what we're experiencing now. And yet, I pulled up pictures from 1920, and it's unbelievable how life returned and the way in which it returned. It returned at amazing speed, and it didn't just return. It went beyond what people had been experiencing in the 1910s. People were back on the streets and doing, big crowds and baseball games and political rallies. It was a release from inhibition. People had a very difficult time with the war and with the epidemic. And there was this release that led to the Roaring Twenties. And it seems pretty clear that's where we're going to head again, the Roaring Twenties. Now, some people might say, look, some of us are too scarred. We have, we're always going to remain cautious and so on. And, that has yet to be seen. And it's certainly a possibility. But the next generation's rebound is always faster than we ever expect. Just as an example, I teach here at Stanford, and if I ever mention in class, what it felt like to me, an important event, a moment in my life, like September 11th, 2001, when the planes crashed into the towers, I have to stop and remind myself that every single bright young adult in the room was born after that happened. All of my students are, 18, 19, 20 years old. They weren't even alive when that happened. And so by the same token, it's not going to be long before there's a new generation that has only read about this lockdown but hasn't experienced it. And, we will seem to them like people who lived through the Great Depression and had, funny habits and so on. And so it always surprises me how rapidly things change. And it's hard to see that in advance because it's easy to see looking backwards, but it's always very difficult to see it looking forward because we always expect that we will be exactly the same person that we are right now, even though that's never been true. Because we always buy into this cognitive illusion that while we've been changing up to now, we've finally reached who we are. But fundamentally, we're extremely social creatures, and we are going to go back to this quite rapidly. And that's why it's such a pleasure to get to talk with you today about the relationship between this exhibit on the 1920s and where we're heading in the 2020s. And so, in 100 years, I can't wait for our grandchildren to visit this museum for the exhibition on where we have gone in the 2020s and how we've taken our creativity and used it to launch into a decade that is better than what would have happened otherwise. So, in summary, I just want to say that although this past year has broken down our internal models and replaced all of our exclamation marks with question marks, there have been some great silver linings that have come out of it. And it's allowed us to see a side of our lives that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. And the interesting part is it's as good for your brain as if you just took up violin or juggling or something. We're all going to come out different and a little bit more flexible in our thinking on the other side of this. So I'd like to say thank you, and I'd like to move to discussion so that we can do some Q&A here. Thank you so much.
you. Thank you, David. That was fantastic. Can you hear us?
Hear you, yes.
Excellent, thank you. So that was very interesting, and I love the way you presented the upsides. We are so close to all the suffering and all the difficulties from last year that connecting what we lived through to what happened 100 years ago and having your vision about what could be the upside of last year is really brilliant. And I would like to ask you, you say DNA is only part of who we are. Experience, space, and what we live, more or less, is what makes us who we are. So I wanted to ask you, are we more similar to our relatives from 100 years ago, those that live in the 1920s, than we are to our relatives that live in the 70s or in the 80s? How can we connect those experiences with ours?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because so much of the world changed from the 1920s. Just basically technology is enough to make it so that, as I mentioned, we're so used to having instant communication around the world. And by the way, just the fact that we were able to make a vaccine in such a short time was unimaginable in the 1920s. So I think we're probably in some sense closer to our relatives in the 1970s and 80s. But the interesting question is, are we closer to our relatives in 1920 or in 2120? In other words, 100 years from now. And the interesting part is that because of the speed of technology and how fast the world is changing, we're definitely closer to 1920 people than we are to 2120. In other words, our great-great-grandchildren will be so different from us because of the way the world is changing with extreme speed, that they're just going to be very different. And this has to do with the issue of brain plasticity, which is to say, our DNA, just as you said, our DNA has a little bit to do with who we are and how we grow and how our whole machinery comes together. But in fact, most of who we are comes from brain plasticity. What is amazing about the human species is that we drop into the world half-baked. We're not fully cooked yet. And so this is why human infants have a very long infancy and they're helpless for a very long time, because they have to absorb the world around them. And the amazing part is that an infant gets to absorb all of human knowledge that has happened up to this point, and then they can springboard off of that.
Right.
So, if you are a horse that's born now, you're just like a horse born 10,000 years ago, and you have to, just live your horse life. But if you're a baby born now, you get to take everything that's happened and learn that in your first several years, right, and then you can take off from there. This is what is so special about humans and brain plasticity. And by the way, I'll just mention one thing really quickly, which is, every time I'm flying in an airplane, if I'm passing over a forest, for example, I look out the window and I look at the forest below, and it's exactly the same as it was 10,000 years ago. All the animal species are living and doing their things just like they were. But when you arrive at your destination city, it's like a motherboard has risen up from the earth. When you look at a city, a human city, it's one species that has changed the landscape so much that it looks like something from outer space. And it's because of our brain plasticity. It's because of our ability to have flexible brains that are not pre-programmed.
Right, because that's very interesting to hear. because what we are presenting in the exhibition is precisely that variety of creativity and progress that developed after the aftermath of the war and the pandemic. And creativity is an element that is fundamental to that part of history, and how those brains that had a choice to get fixed into the negativity and trauma of what we lived, of what they lived, or go into the more positive outcome and look for different alternatives and solutions. That's what happened at the time. And that connects to us today in a museum, which purpose is to inspire and offer different perspectives through art and the values of art. I think that is relevant today. So could you tell us a little bit more about creativity, how the creative process happened 100 years ago, and what can happen now to us? Many of us in Spain, and I believe everywhere else, as you described, started untapping our own creativity and discovering we were able to write, paint, play instruments, maybe because we were at lockdown and there were not much to do. But I think this is an important element, given that we are in a museum. How creativity happened then, and what can happen now?
Yeah, great. So first I'll just mention what creativity is from the brain's point of view. You go around and you absorb the world. You see things, you see art and science and whatever. All of this gets put in the brain, and then creativity is about remixing that. It's about bending and breaking and blending and generating new versions of things that you've absorbed before. And most of those things aren't any good, and so the other half of creativity is filtering those out. But every once in a while, you'll put two things together, or you'll break something, or you'll blend whatever, and you'll say, oh, that's actually pretty good. That actually works for what I'm trying to do. Now, what's interesting is this is part of the basic software of human brains, and this is what brains do: is they absorb the world and they remix it. What's been interesting about this pandemic time, I think, is having, let me put it this way. We've essentially gotten kicked off of our hamster wheels. So you know how hamsters run on a wheel, and going into 2020, we were all doing that. We had our careers, we had our jobs, we had our lives. It was just standard stuff. And what happened is the wheel fell over, and we had to rethink things in a new way. And that's been the magic of times like this. Nobody enjoyed this lockdown period, but the magic is that it has forced us to take everything that we know and start putting new things together in new ways. And from the very beginning of this pandemic, I think all of us saw creativity coming out around us. Just as one example off the top of my head, there was a video that I saw pretty early on in Italy where a bunch of neighbors in an apartment complex were playing bingo by shouting across the courtyard to each other. It's just like a fun thing, but somehow they thought of doing this. A neighbor of mine who likes to play tennis, everything was closed down, so she called people on Airbnb and said, hey, can I just rent out your tennis court for 2 hours? And everybody just did there's nothing special about this, except it was creative. It was something that people hadn't seen before, but they said, well, gosh, given this situation, what if I did this a different way than normal? And so that's essentially the main the main thing, is that we're a very creative species, but now we found ourselves in a situation where we had both the time and the motivation to really think of things that are very new, and that's what launches us into this next decade.
Right. So I can hear you saying that it's very likely that we are going into a similar normality that will be very creative. Are we hopefully seeing a similar period in terms of progress and artistic development as we saw 100 years ago, you think?
Let me just make sure I heard the question. You said, will it be the same as 100 years ago?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Well, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but you have a very good understanding of our brains. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'll be better than 100 years ago, and here's why. It's because of the internet. Actually, I'm a giant fan of what the internet means for us. So all of us, enjoy the internet, and we appreciate it. But in fact, what it has meant for our civilization, it's probably the biggest change that has ever happened to our species, and possibly that ever will happen to our species. Because what we have now is instant worldwide communication. I mean, here I am in Spain, and I'm in Silicon Valley, and we're talking, having a conversation. This really matters, because what it means is that when any new thing is discovered in science, it's known instantly everywhere across the world. And any kid can look it up, can see, for example, the latest things that I'm doing in my neuroscience lab, can think, oh, that reminds me of something else that I saw over here, put those together, do the next thing, instantly it goes around the world. So absolutely, we have become a much more creative society, and where we are now is going to be the super Roaring Twenties. I mean, I think it's going to be better than it ever has been before. And again, this is not just speculation. If you actually plot out the sorry, I wish I had put this slide in my thing here. If you plot out where the world has gone in terms of the in terms of innovation, it turns out that things were very slow for a very long time. You had the agricultural revolution, you had the building of cities and so on, and then things started moving by like the 1700s. And just in the last few years, I mean, a few decades, things have gone almost straight up from landing on the moon to inventing vaccines to inventing the internet and quantum computation and just everything that we're doing. But this has happened so rapidly. So we're heading into the 2020s at this angle, whereas we headed into the 1920s at a different angle. So I think what that means is we have the opportunity for creativity to be something that is even better, 10 times better than what we saw before.
Excellent. Thank you. That's great. Shall we open the floor to our guests here today, and maybe you have some questions? Is there anything you would like to ask to Dr. Eagleman?
Well, I was wondering if I could ask in English.
Yes,
is it
yes.
okay? Okay, thank you. Well, I'm one of those youngsters who hasn't experienced that kind of historic events like the September 11th terrorist attack. But despite that, I believe that our generation is marked by traumatic events like, I don't know, for instance, the 2008 crisis and how it affected the social mentality. That's why I think that I was shocked with your words and how you think that the pandemic and digital connectivity may foster a new era of artistic, social, cultural progress, because I think that our generation is marked by trauma and by a negative mindset. And I think that given the polarization and radicalization that nowadays is present in the political arena, I think that we tend to believe that new years to come are going to be marked by, well, that they're going to be worse years, that we are going to suffer, I don't know, the effects of climate change, the effects of social injustice, and that I think that maybe those events in which the political arena has been affected and how the political discourse has become more and more infantile and more brutal may shake the world and make it a worse place. I don't know if you think that we youngsters having a bad mentality regarding the future may affect the way in which the new years are going to be regarding the arts and culture. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that very important question. Here's what I think. This is just one person's opinion, but I am a cyber optimist. I think that the next generation is actually going to be much better than previous generations, and let me tell you why. First of all, every generation has had their problems and their deep concerns. Just imagine, I know there are a lot of things about right now that don't feel so good, but imagine growing up during World War I or World War II, or, in this country, Vietnam War or Korean War or various things like this. Things looked a lot worse at various points. Climate change is a big issue. For better or worse, it's a slow issue. And so what's going to happen is, coastal cities are going to change and so on, but that's at a very slow pace. And we at least are trying to figure out ways to make that happen and to mitigate the problem as much as possible. So here's what I would say. There are a bunch of problems that your generation is going to face. I don't know that they're worse than previous generations. And I think there's some good news in there, which is that the next generation is absolutely going to be smarter than we are. And this is for a very particular reason. It's that the way brain plasticity works is the brain changes the most when it's in the context of curiosity. In other words, you have the right chemicals present when you're asking a question and you get the answer. And what happened for all the old people like me is that we went to school and we had a lot of just in case knowledge taught to us. Okay, just in case you ever need to know when the Battle of Hastings that was in 1066. Okay, fine. But what your generation gets is a lot of just-in-time knowledge. So as soon as you're curious about something, you ask Google, you ask Alexa, you get the answer right when you're curious about something, and that allows your brain to actually retain the information. And I have 2 kids, and I see the way that they're going to be so much smarter than we are because of the availability of knowledge around them. And yes, they play video games and do stupid stuff and waste time also, but the main thing is they're learning information about the world and putting things together at a very rapid pace, such that at 9 years old they can actually know more than we knew before. And so the thing about people being polarized and having politically, terrible things to say, there's actually nothing new about that. Just look at last century. Look at the communist revolution in China or in Russia. Tens of millions of people politically executed. What we're facing now, there's lots of bad stuff now. It's really nothing compared to the 20th century. So this is just one person's opinion, but I actually think where we are right now is really not so bad. And being a student of history is really important to set the context so that we know where we are right now. Thank you for that question.
Gracias. Tenemos otra pregunta ahí arriba, ¿verdad?
Okay. Good morning, David. Congratulations for your talk. I'm going to introduce some authors because I'm interested in your opinion of them. I'm going to say it very briefly. Rafael Yuste is a Spanish neurologist who's working in the United States. I cannot know which university. He said in one book that this is the time, this century, to know the complete map of the brain. Speaking metaphorically, he said, well, we know the brain with bad quality, few pixels. We'll get to know it almost perfectly with all clarity. That is a question for you. And the other one is, the changes are so huge and rapid that this South Korean philosopher in Germany says, we do not inhabit the time. This Han, Byung-Han or something. The changes are so rapid that we do not inhabit the time? And I think it's an interesting question. The other one is, I'm going to finish and then you say whatever you feel like saying. You are very optimistic and very positive, and I am with you. Do you think that when we improve the knowledge of the brain, the noise of the brain, the noise that Daniel Kahneman talks about in his new book, Daniel Kahneman with other two authors, will be possible to reduce the noise, all the interference in our evaluation of reality and in the making of decisions? And finally, and thank you for your patience, I don't think you agree with Steven Pinker when he says we are not a blank slate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Those
are all great questions. Let me answer them.
Yeah, that's a lot to cover.
I can do them quickly.
No, absolutely. Gracias por sus preguntas. That's a lot to cover in just 5 minutes, but I'm sure you'll manage, will you?
Yeah, I can answer this very quick. Yeah. First question about brain technology. I think that's exactly right, what Rafael Yuste said, which is our technology right now is very crude for measuring the brain, but it's getting better and better. And it just is not going to be that long, maybe 20, 30 years before we can actually measure all 86 billion neurons in real time. And that might be, maybe I'm wrong, it's not 20 years, maybe it's 50 years, but it's going to happen, this in this century. So that's the good news. Second thing about whether we're living in our time, I suspect that it's always the case that people are not living in their time because changes always seem quite rapid. Just imagine being a German citizen in the 1930s, and then suddenly things are changing rapidly, and you've got the communists and the Nazis, and they get elected, and then suddenly Hindenburg dies, and the Nazi party takes over, and suddenly if you're a Jewish German citizen, everything goes, and suddenly you're on a train. I mean, things happen rapidly a lot, and I suspect we're never really in our time, and things can only be understood in retrospect. As far as Steven Pinker goes, the issue is we do come to the table not as a blank slate. We have 19,000 genes that sort of wire up the brain with its basic architecture. From there, though, we absorb the world. And Pinker and I agree on this thing, which is that, yes, there's a lot of stuff that we're pre-programmed with, like the ability to learn language. But from there, everything is about brain plasticity. And there was one more question you asked, and I'm just trying to remember what it was.
Daniel Kahneman, noise.
Yeah, I can't remember what the fourth one was. I'm sorry about that.
It was Kahneman's new.
But that's my quick answer. Hopefully that suffices.
Right. I'm not sure if you got that final question about the noise. Kahneman's book.
Yeah. Thank you. The general story is that we have the brain is made up of lots of different neural networks that are always competing to drive your behavior. And as a result, we are very complicated creatures. And we will never get rid of the noise in the sense that you can try to be as rational as you want to be, but you're never going to defeat millions of years of evolution because we're complicated creatures. If I put some warm chocolate chip cookies in front of you, part of your brain wants to eat that because it's a rich energy source. Part of your brain says, don't eat it, you'll get fat. Part of your brain says, okay, I'll eat it, but I'll go to the gym tonight and work out. You've got all kinds of voices in your head all the time, and there's no way that we are ever going to get rid of that and be like Mr. Spock in Star Trek.
Excellent, thank you. So we might have time for one more question, like final question.
Hi, David. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm really interested. I like the ideas of the little spinning wheels and the gerbils and all that sort of stuff, and that's shaking up the brain. I really like it. I studied philosophy, and I'd like to talk to you, just ask you about what you think about Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was notorious for being a person who worked like clockwork. In fact, they said that they set the clocks in Heidelberg by looking out the window of the time he had breakfast, the time he walked to the university, etc. Incredibly methodical man, which of course there are other examples of that type of, for example, Isaac Newton was notorious for being a complete recluse and, a bit of a strange, weird man locked away in his room. Yet both of them, particularly Kant, Kant in his Critique of Pure Reason, produced probably one of the most influential works of all time. I just wondered whether, is that a contradiction, or do you think there's some sort of, he maybe had the room full of gerbils or something, or what do you think?
I'll tell you, it's a great question, thank you. Human brains are always trying to balance between novelty and familiarity, and we're always seeking that balance. And so, part of the difficulty with the pandemic was having so much routine, and what we wanted was novelty. But if you're in a time when you're having too much novelty, you can't keep that going. You need people immediately seek things where they have some routine. And so the challenge, especially in the first few weeks of this pandemic, was for people to try to find the sweet spot between novelty and familiarity. My suspicion about Immanuel Kant is that precisely because he was off in such novel spaces with his thinking, that he found it useful to establish a routine. I eat breakfast at this time, I do this, Same with Albert Einstein, he always wore the same clothes. He had multiple versions of the same clothes in his closet. Lots of people who are doing things that are very new and require a lot of brain energy to think in completely novel ways have to seek routine in other parts of their life so that other parts are nailed down so that they can balance with the novelty. Thanks for that question.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, David. It's been very inspiring, opening new perspectives, connecting 1920s with today's, bringing the upsides of what we are living and connecting it with the exhibition, with the content, the progress, and all the beautiful objects and works that we are exhibiting here at the moment. So I hope you can come and visit the exhibition at some point. It would be amazing. For our audience, take the opportunity to visit. It's worthwhile, and with the views and the understanding of our brain, I think you will enjoy it even more. So thank you everyone for being with us this afternoon, this evening, and thank you, David. Good morning and a good day to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.